Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Log Talk with Pertney Outdoors. This is your host, Billy, and this week we have a special episode coming to you, one that is a little bit different than what you normally hear on here, and I hope you've enjoyed a couple of these weeks in a row where we've put together some different chats with some different people and trying to kind of change up and enjoy the winter months and have some different types of conversations. So this week will be a conversation. I kind of struggled for a title, what would be a good catchy title for this individual, but the overall discussion is going to be around forestry and conservation and things of that nature. I thought a great person to have on for this would be Todd Waldron. This is a discussion that over the last year or so, especially getting more involved in conservation myself, and listening to a lot of the things that are going on now currently around the country and around New York State, some of the things that are going on. Forestry is something that's become more and more interesting to me, and the environment has become something is becoming more and more interesting to me and everyone out there, regardless of what your stance is politically, your beliefs on what the environment and how we should take care of it, what we should be doing to move things forward. I think if you're not thinking about it, I think you're doing yourself an injustice to try to understand where we all play in this discussion of sustainability, and that comes up quite a bit in this discussion in the environment and the world we live in. So we can truly not just talk about the fact we want to leave it better than we found it, but we really should be actively doing something about that. So with that said, Todd is somebody who, if you don't know him, I'm guessing many of you do that listen to our podcast, probably a lot of crossover. But if you haven't heard of Todd, Todd is a podcast host himself. He started a podcast several years ago called East to West Hunting Podcast. He recently has started another under the Modern Carnivore platform, and that's Outdoor Feast. Both very thought-provoking, interesting discussions, kind of not your everyday hunting strategy type podcast. He's getting into some deeper discussions and having some interesting guests on to talk about different things. So Todd, I knew, would be right up the alley for this discussion. And Todd's a guy who I admire a lot. I take a lot of I'm trying to think of the right word, but he's kind of somebody that I look up to in this space, both in conservation and in podcasting. Todd's a big reason why I got started with this, and somebody that really was one of probably the first in New York State to have a local-based podcast, with him being out of the Adirondack area, or the out of New York, but residing in the Adirondacks, certainly brings a lot to the table here. So Todd also just started a new position, which I'll let him talk about, but he is the Forest Conservation Director for the Ruffed Grouse and American Woodcock Society. So that's a very new transition for him. I'm very excited for him as he will talk about what he has going on over there, an organization and things I had no idea really were going on. It's not exactly an organization that is real flashy and sexy and out there. I don't think a lot of people know about it. They're not, some of the big game animals that everybody is thinking about, but Todd had some very interesting thoughts to go along with that. So we'll get into discussions about that, about just the environment in general, where we as people, as users of this environment and the earth we live on, how do we stand? Where do we have to do? And these are all just things that I think it's important. And I don't think the normal hunter is thinking about this, and but I think the normal outdoors enthusiast is thinking about this. So I think we as hunters need to start having this discussion, and I really hope that this podcast, I really hope this thing blows up, because I think this is a discussion that needs to be had, needs to be heard. It's not lectury, or we're not pushing any ideas, but I think we're just talking about issues and things that are going on that I think just the general outdoorsman that loves to go out and hunt deer and catch bass, I think we all need to have these things in our minds and understand some of the stuff that's going on around us, and the things that you may not really need to physically do anything. It's just more or less being aware of what's going on around you. Because as I've pounded on the drum on here, we need to be putting forth the best image for our, representing who we are as hunters and fishermen and recreationalists. We need to be putting forth the best image. So that is really going to come around to be the moral of this discussion. And at the end, there's something been kind of eating me up a little bit that I've been trying to figure out the right person to ask the opinion of here locally. And Todd answered that question, I think, beautifully. And it comes back around to leadership. And people need to step up. We need to be leaders as people in this outdoor space, as hunters. We want to be the ones coming to the table with solutions, with ideas on how we can make things better, instead of being the classic setback and let somebody else do the work or complain about it and just say, we're just going to keep it the way it used to be. That is not going to help us sustain the lifestyle we have and help to move things forward and ultimately bring people together. And I've been hearing many discussions of late on podcasts, hunting podcasts that are around that tone, and I do like to hear that quite a bit. One that's fresh in my mind is the Deer Hunter podcast with Kevin Vissison. He put that out this past Friday with Sam Soholt. Sam is another individual that we look up to a lot here at Pert Near Outdoors. He does a lot of great things for conservation, and was another one of those individuals that kind of gave us the kick to start a podcast. And really cherish people like that and appreciate them for having faith in individuals and wanting to encourage people to chase an idea or chase a passion. And that discussion that Sam and Kevin had was very interesting. Towards the end of the discussion, they got into some of these sort of similar discussions about conservation and what does all that mean, and looking past what the headline is in the news to better understand what all is going on in these big pictures. So that prompted me to reach out to Sam, and I'm going to try to get him on here because I think if you don't know who he is, I think you'd all really love to hear his story and what he's up to personally, as well as the school bus that he's retrofitted, which is been pretty well chronicled, but that's maybe a discussion for another day. Okay, I think that's my intro. If you could, please help us spread this podcast around. If you enjoy the discussion and would like to help us with that, just the best way to do it is, share it on your social media platforms, put it up in your story or put it up on your, share the post on your Facebook page or your Instagram page. Really just help us get this out there, because I think as outdoorsmen and women here in New York, we really need to be talking about these things and helping bridge the gap, bring people together, and help move things in the right direction. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation. Here's Todd Waldron and myself chatting about all things forestry and the outdoors. So thank you, everybody. Have a great week, and keep fading up. Hello. Yeah, that's your name.
Squirrels got me.
Big Jim.
Yeah.
Really, 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 really cold and fun.
Cold and fun.
Cold and fun.
That's good that you think that of it, because that's what deer hunting typically is cold and fun.
Yesterday morning, I'm glassing up on the pass, and I see these deer moving, and I'm like, ooh, there's some deer moving. All of a sudden, I just see this person just head down, just hauling ass, wearing shorts and a t-shirt with a pack on. And I'm like, is that Tard? My dad always talks about floating through the woods like the autumn breeze.
So Robert's
when you're
the
275 pounds, I don't know how you do that, but
the Freightliner. It's just like a creeper. You're just kind of up in the corner watching what's going on down there.
yeah. He's like,
he's up there slapping, pissing all over everything.
is it warm yet?
How did you know the name of the actor?
That's right. I know.
Why did you say his name?
Hervé Villagers.
You know what pert near means.
If you know what pert near means and you live in America, you're a redneck too.
Welcome to the Log Talk Podcast, brought to you by Pert Near Outdoors. Uncle
Hey,
Todd.
Billy.
Uncle Todd, how are you?
I'm pretty good. What's going on today?
It's my first time ever doing a virtual podcast. Yeah,
Well, I'm glad to be here.
yeah, yeah. My internet, been having some funky internet issues today with both my computers, and then this one didn't want to connect to the internet or even acknowledge that I had a router producing Wi-Fi in the house. So there you go. Must be a Friday.
I've had stuff like that happen too, and it's goofy stuff. You never know what it's going to be. Like the other night, so I haven't podcasted in a while, and I talked to this guy, Caleb Stillians he's this Alaska guy. He's actually a really cool dude. He reached out and he's like, hey, check this out. Would you be interested in having me on? And usually if somebody reaches out, I'm usually like, yeah, sure, I'm cool about it. If they're cool people, like I'd gladly have, just talk to you. I've never heard of this guy. Well, anyway, I was using this. Have you ever heard of Zencaster? It's
Mm-mm.
kind of like Zoom, but it's just like what it's doing is it's kind of like a cross between Zoom and Skype, and it's just collecting your audio files and then just uploads it. But they just changed things, and I didn't know it. So it's one of those deals where I have them on the podcast, and it takes me 10 minutes to figure out the new website because it's completely different than it was 3 weeks ago. And
Totally threw you for a loop.
yeah, it was all good. But I guess my point is that, man, it's like never ending. You never know what's going to happen with this stuff. And
No,
sometimes technology is, just a pain, but
it's a blessing and a curse, right?
So you sound pretty good. The audio's coming through good. The signal sounds pretty good here. So
Yeah, no, you sound fantastic as well.
cool.
So just go ahead and kind of make the official introduction. So this week, I'm very happy and I'm very excited for this discussion. I get really pumped up every time I talk to you, probably because you were one of the inspirations of me starting my own podcast, and you kind of gave me a kick in the butt when you had me on your show back almost 2 years ago now, and kind of showed me the way with podcasting, and couldn't be happier to have you on with me here today to chat about some stuff that you and I have been chatting on the phone about. So Todd Waldron, thanks for jumping on today for a little Log Talk podcast.
Yeah, Billy, it's an honor to be here. It's so much fun. I always enjoy catching up with you. And that podcast we did a couple of years ago in Saratoga at the park was one of the most popular podcast episodes for East to West. It was cool, and people really loved it and got a lot of traction. And so I was just really glad to connect on that one, and glad to follow all the great stuff you're doing at Pertinier with Log Talk and all your Facebook Live events. It's really exciting to see how awesome you folks have been just growing and putting together this platform. It's great.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it's a grind. You've been through it. You do it. It's sometimes you question, why am I doing what I'm doing? But you see the steady growth, and you take a step back, and it feels like it's been 5 years, but it's only been a little over a year we've been doing this, and it's continuing to grow. So it's rewarding, and trying to find your voice and trying to find a way to make a difference. I'm doing most of the work with the group here and with the podcast. So for me, I'm a very passionate person, and I want to make a difference, so it's trying to figure out that path of, I don't have the time or the desire to write, I'm not a video guy. I don't have the time or desire to create video content. So podcast just kind of seems to be my little niche, but it's, how do I continue to produce content that's valuable and educational and entertaining, but then also, make a difference. Like that's the big thing. And I think that is kind of a large, theme of today's discussion is, there's obviously a lot going on in life all the time, but it seems like there's a lot happening like right now this second. And if you just look inside of our own little world of outdoors lifestyle, there's a lot happening right now. And, just trying to figure out like, how do I fit into that, and how can I be of value to make a difference and make sure that what I've experienced growing up is just as good or better for my son and my daughter once they get to that point,
Yeah, most definitely. And I think it shows, like you're talking about your passion and you're finding your voice. And I think every episode, it just like keeps it's so good with what you folks are doing, and I enjoy following it. And it really shines through, like your passion and your commitment to the outdoors and what you're bringing to the conversation, and just like all the different guests that you've got on. I just say keep raining it down because it's working and it resonates. It's good content, and I think there's demand for that. People like it.
Yeah. Thank you again, man. I
Mhm.
just a love fest here. The hard part is too, is that it's a very crowded medium right now. And everybody's fighting for that time, and that's the hard part to me, because I would love to have a 30-minute discussion, but I have a very hard time covering what I want to cover in that short period of time. So it's
Mhm.
an ongoing battle. It's something that will always be that. But it seems like once you can reach that point where you've got people's attention, and you've got that, and it almost comes down to, like, that you trust. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and the people that I listen to them because I value and trust what they're bringing to me, the listener. So I think it's just growing that consistency, growing that trust. And that kind of comes back around to you, because I take a lot of guidance, and I try to learn a lot from you, because and I was telling my dad this the other day, and obviously, my dad, loves listening to your stuff, and you have a very unique way of breaking it down. And maybe that's just, where you're at in life. But you're very good at bridging the gaps and bringing people together and telling a story and making it so that it's digestible and understanding. And you don't need an hour and a half to 2 hours to do that, like your friend Billy here. So I'm trying to learn from you, but that's why, as I was thinking about this discussion, there's the big discussion today is around, I want to talk about forestry and talk about what's going on with you and your new endeavor and your career. But you couldn't be a better person, I think, to bring on here, because you have a voice that's trusted and a voice that's respected. And it's not, somebody pounding on the table saying, we got to do this, we got to do that. You are invested into a lot of different categories, into a lot of different social groups, and there's a lot of value to that. So
Yeah, I appreciate that. That means the world to me. And, it's taken a long time for me. That doesn't come natural for me. It's something I've had to work on for years and years and years. And I've gotten a lot of help with it. So for a lot of people that have helped me out with a lot of different things. We all have mentors, and we all have people that really we look up to, and so it's a rising tide with that for sure.
yeah,
So it's great to be here. So
yeah.
glad to talk forestry. Glad to hear what you've been up to, and looking forward to the combo.
Yeah. So first, as we get into the career changes, the first actually has nothing to do with you. I'm very intrigued with what your wife does, and I'm wondering if it's something that I have some experience with. So she's an EOS implementer. Is that correct?
She is an EOS implementer. And
Is that
so EOS stands for Entrepreneurial Operating System. And so it follows this book by Gino Wickman, I think his name is, or Gino Wick.
traction?
Traction.
Yep.
Yeah. And so her background is in healthcare. And so for years and years, she spent probably almost 25 years in healthcare in practice management, and then transitioned out of that a couple of years ago, started her own management business with a focus on transitioning systems. And she caught on to this EOS stuff, and she's really good at it. So she got connected with that whole thing, and she's doing, she's like a provider and a trainer, and she helps companies grow their business, and it's awesome. She's crushing it. Are you familiar? So like, what's your role with it?
Yeah. So the company I work for, Leonard Boss, we are on the path. We have been for many, for probably going on 4 years now. Some of the principles of that were starting to get introduced, and then it was something that throughout the entire company, from ownership down, was a book that everybody needed to read and understand, and so I saw that, and I'm like, EOS. I'm like, I wonder if that's the same thing that she's doing. So, it's interesting to see, we don't talk about it as much, but you can feel the imprint that it's made on our business and the way things operate. And, one of the biggest, there's a lot of things from that book that I listened to it because I just drive all the time everywhere. So I've listened to that book, but there's a lot of things to take away from that, in many ways, that, I think the one thing was like, would you rather sell $20 million of something and lose $2 million, or would you rather sell 10 and make $2 million? And it's like little stuff like that has stuck with me over the last 3-4 years. There's a lot of principles from that book, and that's just super cool. I had to ask you that because I was curious, and I've seen it, and I've seen, it seems like your wife's doing really well with that, and I've seen some awards she's won and stuff too. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's cool. She's gonna love that connection, and she really likes it. She's good at it. She just became like a formal implementer where there's only like I don't know how many there are in the country, but there's not a lot, and there might be like 300 in the world or something like that. But
probably not too many of them live in the Adirondacks, right?
No, but she went through that, and it's just she's doing well, and it's the kind of thing too that it's helpful. Like I think of that and try to assimilate into like our conservation work, right? Because all of the principles there around organization and the traction principles, you can take that and think about it in terms of, okay, how are we going to be a more effective conservation group? How can we leverage this stuff? Even if you're not in a for-profit situation, there's so much to learn from running your organization and your mission with a focus,
Mm-hmm. No doubt.
Mm-hmm.
So let's move on to the Todd. So you have recently taken on a new chapter, work-wise, moving on from the position you had with, I'm not sure exactly, I know kind of the field you were in, but you've moved into a completely new endeavor. And why don't you talk a little bit about that and what that looks like?
I'm glad to talk about that. So I have spent my entire career in forestry and forest conservation here in the Northeast. And so a lot of the roles that I played were on the private land side, through consulting, helping landowners make good decisions, informed decisions about their land, how they can use and enjoy it and be good stewards. And then also a bunch of roles with like real estate and helping people acquire forest land for various reasons, and even spent like 10 years in industry on the front end of my career down in Bradford County in PA. So I recently joined Ruffed Grouse Society, American Woodcock Society, as their forest conservation director here in the Northeast. And I am absolutely thrilled, Billy, to be in this situation for a lot of reasons. For one, it's a great team. So the people that are coalescing around the RGS team, some of the people that have come on as hires over the last couple of years, I am absolutely pumped to be working with these folks. So it's a great team. Ben Jones, our CEO, has an incredible vision for forest conservation beyond just rough grouse and American woodcock. I mean, it's we'll get into this, but it's really about forest habitat diversity for all species and for a lot of things beyond wildlife too, for sustainable rural economies and for clean air and water, climate. So the big vision, cool team. And so like my role is uniting conservationists around sustainable forestry and wildlife conservation and habitat issues, and connecting those dots. And how cool of a job is that, right? I mean, if, with a background in forestry, with a passion for conservation and wildlife and hunting and angling, to be able to just step into a role like that, it's just so incredible. And it's inspiring to me. Like I can't wait to get up in the morning. I'm working hard. Only been here like 4 weeks, but I'm pumped about being here. So it's pretty cool stuff. So I work throughout the Northeast, New England, and so it's Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and then Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York. And so I still get to work from home. So I'm still over here in Chestertown in the Adirondacks, and yeah, so it's going great so far. I'm excited.
And that, the Ruffed Grouse Society is one that is not on a lot of people's radar. And to hear the depth of their vision of the impact that they can make, that's very interesting. And I think I'd like to understand more about that. And you and I talked a little bit on the phone the other day about some of the things that you're working on, some of the things that I wanted to discuss today. But one of the things that got me thinking about wanting to have this conversation, and I wanted to have this conversation with you about timber management, forest management, forestry, those words, those hot button words, it was driven from a podcast you did. It was a couple episodes ago. It was 118, conservation in the Adirondack Park.
Mhm.
And it was a fascinating conversation. I listened to it when it first came out. So that probably was back in early January, maybe. And I just listened to it again on my way home from work just to kind of get my brain turning. So I started making a bunch of notes, and I know how active you've been in conservation. You started the chapter here essentially you were very involved with the chapter here for backcountry hunters and anglers. So you're very involved in that aspect. You're involved in many other conservation organizations as a member. And you kind of live that life of what I feel conservation is, which is being an active participant in the environment, making a difference, but you're also understanding that hunting and fishing and hiking, camping, running, all the things that we do outside, we're active participants in the environment, which to me is conservation, and making sure that it stays that way and that you're not just keeping it the way it is, but you're looking to make it better.
Mhm.
Something that I'm curious what your definition of conservation is in the realm of all the things that you do, because I think there's a lot of people, and I wrote down active conservation versus passive conservation. So what I mean by that is I feel like there's misconception between the conservation of, like, we as hunters, just speaking as hunters, that we are taking, quote unquote, taking from the land. And you guess you could look at it the same way as a timber minded person, where you're cutting trees and improving habitat. You are taking from the land, but we are active participants in that process to ultimately try to help and make things better, whether it be with the forest health or the health of a deer herd that is overpopulated. I guess I'm interested in your perspective on, like, conservation, because I think there's a divide. I think there's a divide between the people that think that hunting and fishing and timber management are bad and things should be left to the wild and that they shouldn't be touched. That, like, those folks think they're conservationists too. So I think there's the word conservation gets thrown everywhere, but it's like, I don't think we all have the same definition of what that is. Does that make sense to you? Or
I think you're exactly right. I think that's the spot on opportunity and challenge, is that there's a lot of ways to define conservation, and that there's a lot of activity around that, and what it means on the ground, right? So for some, conservation might be something like a phrase like "leave no trace" or something like that, right? And for some others, it might be like working for a land trust and protecting land. For hunters and anglers, we know what we contribute, as active participants with our funding and our contributions, how we played a role in the North American conservation model. So there's a lot of different ways to think about conservation. And I think that one thing I'm learning over time is that it's kind of a fluid narrative. And by that, I mean, it's a dynamic conversation in terms of it can change over time. There's a lot of different ways of looking at it. It's not just one particular thing. And the real power of conservation in my mind, Billy, is when we focus on those commonalities instead of thinking about our differences with our approaches, like how we get to a certain place. If you focus on what are we really all interested in, right?
Mhm.
And so I think even with people that have different opinions than me on the value of harvesting trees or hunting or anything like that, when you look at things like biodiversity or clean water or open space or how we're going to fund all this or how we're going to stay connected to all this, I think if we can frame those conversations in that way, in terms of like, hey, okay, I hear you say you don't want to cut trees, but what's the underlying value behind that? What are you really getting at? Because I think you love the outdoors too, and so I do too, and so there's a commonality. So let's talk about how we can kind of think about the process in a big way to actually to be able to make things happen, if that makes sense. So I think that just recognizing that it means different things to different people, and that there's different ways that you can contribute. So you can contribute individually, you can contribute through your conservation groups, so just keeping the big picture in mind, I think, is important. And I think I was having this conversation with a couple of colleagues the other day, and I think it's easy to be overprotective sometimes with our resources, and think in terms of, okay, we have this mindset. If you think of conservation as a spectrum, it kind of developed out of this 19th century crisis of a timber famine, and right, like we had natural resource famines, we had wildlife populations on the brink, and so we had timber that was extractively being cut without forest management prior to the birth of forestry. And so there was all this crisis around that. And so the answer was just to, on the front end, it was a lot of like protective things. But I think we're at a point now where we're in the 21st century, and a lot of those protections have been in place, and we're facing huge global sustainability issues. So like I'm in a master's program right now at Virginia Tech studying sustainability. And so I think that looking forward, like having conversations around sustainability, like how do we actually sustain this stuff? How can we actively participate in a way that can address all this stuff, I think would be helpful. And I think we've been what I consider helicopter conservationists in some ways, where we're not kind of looking at the whole picture. Our intent is really, really good, but we need to broaden our vision and look at the big picture to say, where do we need to take this over the next 50, 60, 100 years?
Yeah. There's so much to everything you just said that it's so true, it's frustrating because it's very hard. Like, and it goes back to the beginning of this discussion about me trying to find my voice and wanting to make a difference. I know, I'm a trail runner. I like to go to these races and compete, and I see people running wearing t-shirts that are, anti, like they're showing they're anti meat eater, they're anti meat. And here I am, somebody that loves running that trail the same amount that person does right next to me, that hates the fact that I eat meat because they don't understand why I eat meat. And I look at them and say, I don't like the fact that you don't eat meat because I don't understand why you don't eat meat. And it's like, it's the same discussion as the pro hunting, the anti-hunting, the pro cutting timber, the anti-cutting timber. Like, we have to more than ever right now in this country, we have to find a way to have those discussions and not have them be defensive discussions because everybody wants to force you to have the same ideas that they have, is kind of the feeling I get in the culture we're in right now. And if it's one heart and one mind at a time that can have a discussion with myself or with you or hear this discussion, is that at the end of the day, we all do love this stuff. Like, it'd break my absolute heart if I couldn't go to Letchworth State Park and go for a hike, or if if because the woods has gotten so bad, there's no more deer there. Or if the park down the street has been so overused that the trails are a disaster and nobody wants to go there anymore. Like, it breaks my heart if that's not there. But just figuring out a way that we can have that discussion to say, look, we all have what we would like to have out of this environment that we're enjoying, but what I do is okay and what you do is okay. We can live together. We don't have to be like, you don't agree, so you need to go sit down. It's like, no, like that's not productive at all. And I've gotten fired up over this last year just because of, how much it feels like, the hot button of the cancel culture. It's because it almost feels like people are forcing whether you are a Trump supporter, or you're a Biden supporter, or you're this or you're that, like, why are you being put in a group? It's like, I look at you, it doesn't matter. I shouldn't care what your background is, what your race, your gender, your preference. It doesn't matter. It's who are you as a person? That's what matters, and the faster we can get back to that and stop saying, well, I am this. It's like, well, no, I'm an outdoorsman. That can be a million things. You're an outdoors woman. It can be a million things. It's like, how do we get to that? And then at that point, I feel like as a group and a culture, we can move forward and achieve great things, like they did back in the early 1900s when they realized that we were in these crises, and leaders stepped up and said, we need to do this right now. And look at what's happened. I mean, the white-tailed deer, the wild turkeys, the the elk, things like that. Those were buffalo. I mean, they were basically hunted right off the landscape, and people stepped up and did something. So like this is our time to figure out a way to step up and have that voice and have those discussions about like, yeah, we have a timber stand that now is 100 years old, and the landscape has changed. So now what do we do? And that's kind of where this whole conversation comes back around to you, and why we are here today is just to kind of discuss forestry and discuss some principles and mindsets of why we do this and why we don't do this type of thing. But I don't know, Todd, I got diarrhea of the mouth right now, and you got me all excited to talk about this. But I mean, does that stuff make sense, or do you agree or disagree with any of those points, or is there anything there that we could unpack further, or would it just be kind of pontificating on it?
Oh, it makes a ton of sense, Billy. Everything you said resonates with me. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think about it a lot. And I think that another thing, the older I get and the more involved I get, I was thinking about, with Rough Grouse Society, for instance, and our messaging and, why it's important to think through forest habitat diversity and what that means. There's so many ways to think through that in terms of how do you communicate that and what are the challenges with all of that. And, I think a good place to start, that we often don't start with our values, but if we did, I think we could have more civil conversations. If we said, in a conversation with somebody that doesn't hunt or doesn't like trees, I value biodiversity. I value clean water. I value clean air. I value outdoor recreation. And if you start talking about your values, and I think that a lot of other folks, whether, however you decide to get there, what your philosophical views are, or your experience or your lenses are around outdoor conservation, those values can unite us, because ultimately, they focus on the commonalities and what we're really trying to do. And so that's just something I've been thinking about, is really, really communicating those values. And I think if you can do that, I think it's a way to be able to enter into conversations productively.
Yeah, that's values. I wrote that down. I like that a lot. I think that it's a great way of looking at it, because it just is, because that's what it comes down to. It's like, mom, what are your values? Family. It's like, well, I love family too. It's just, it's simple stuff.
Yeah, it is. And I think it helps us reflect a little bit too, right? So if you have that kind of conversation, you have to do a little soul searching to say, what's really important to me. And so not just with other people you're talking to, but just a lot of self-reflection as well.
Good thing. So on to talking about, timber and forest management. You and I got discussing that the other day, and it's something that you're actively working in. It sounds like it's right off the jump, you're actively working. It's really what your mission is in the position you're in now with Rough Grouse. So let's just kind of get into that conversation to see where it develops from there. But what I brought to you, and it kind of stemmed off of that conversation you had on your podcast, is the Adirondack State Park, and it's been a discussion I've had on here. We had Josh Ballesteri was on here from the Western New York Land Conservancy, and had a great chat with him. He's a young guy working with that conservancy here in Western New York. And we got talking about like forever wildland and the benefits of like just looking at something like the Adirondacks, and like I totally hear his perspective, but then I look at my experiences in the Adirondacks and how the landscape, even just in my young life, has changed, and the timber has changed, and the wildlife that you see has changed. Things have grown significantly. Doesn't appear to be a ton of mass and a lot of undergrowth for wildlife to live in. And those are the environments that they live in. And, from the neck down, is kind of where you're walking through the woods. If it's wide open, what's, from me looking at it as a hunter, I'm like, what's the value here? But I'm uneducated to the actual forestry piece of it. So that's what stemmed from the discussion you had on your show, is, talking about what a unique piece of land we have with the Adirondack State Park, as it's a contiguous, very, very large piece of contiguous land where you have all these different types of forest and lowlands and swamp and mossy and peat and all these different environments. within one that is all one whole piece. It's very unique. So I want to start with the Adirondacks with you because that's where your roots are. Why do we do things and don't do things in the Adirondacks as far as timber management and looking at it from my perspective as a hunter? I'll just let you go before I keep talking. You go ahead.
Yeah, so glad to talk about the Adirondacks all the time, right? You know how much I love the Adirondacks, and I think that the way we can segue with this, because I think it segues perfectly with what we're doing with Rough Grouse Society, is to think about the Adirondacks as a mosaic, right? As it's a landscape that has a lot of different forest types and different habitat conditions and so forth. And so just to back up a little bit for folks, to kind of how you get your head around the intersection of forestry or, how trees grow or anything like that and how it relates to wildlife is the fact that what we do on the landscape really defines the habitat, right? So what we do or don't do is going to impact things like food and cover and so forth. And of course, there's natural ecosystems that define what's here for any particular reason: climate, soils, latitude, all that stuff. But it is a mosaic. And the thing that, the Adirondacks, I think people have to understand, to have context around the forest preserve and why we've got 2.6 million acres that is forever wild, is the fact that it goes back to that 19th century crisis that we were talking about. So what happened is through the 1800s, there, before there was forestry in the US, which kind of spawned in like the early 1900s with Gifford Pinchot and Furneaux. But prior to that, there was extensive cutting across the Adirondack Park, and much of the land was really cut over pretty significantly. And so that was being cleared, and there weren't forestry measures in place. And so there was kind of like an exploitive nature to it, just like the market hunting of the 1800s would have been. And so what happens is around that time, Rob Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's uncle, and a bunch of friends from New York City say, hey, we're going to have a major problem. The railroad started coming up. Durant built the railroad up here. We started having wildfires because of that. And so the railroad did two things. It cut a lot of wood, because now we had transportation to get the wood to the rivers for the river drives and for the mills. But it also brought people from New York City to come up to see what was going on and to form a need around, hey, we got to do something about this, because we're worried about our drinking water in the Hudson and the flows. So it was a water related issue, actually, that they said we need to protect the forest watershed. And so I think that the reaction was severe because of what was going on at that point, And so in 1885, the Forest Preserve, I think the Adirondack Park was established right after the Forest Preserve. I think the Forest Preserve was established in 85, and then like 1892, the Adirondack Park was established. And so that Forever Wild at that time seemed like a really good idea, because they needed that healing process. The wonderful thing about it is that forests are resilient, and they do respond, and they do heal naturally here in the Northeast. Like in other places in the country, you might have to plant a lot of trees in order to have abundant, lush reforestation. But here in the Northeast, we're blessed with what's called natural regeneration or natural forestation. And so the point there is that these forests are resilient to a certain extent, but they're also very dynamic. And so one of the key points to understanding forest ecosystems or ecology is that dynamic aspect of forest, that things never stay the same. If you go in the woods tomorrow, those woods are different than they were in October, right? And so how it is with hunting season, right? You go to a late muzzleloader hunt in December, that's way different than bow season in Western New York. And it's the same thing with the landscapes. Those things are changing. They're not static. And so when we're thinking about forests, we have to kind of understand that point, because it's really important. And what's happened is forests, one thing that's really important with forests and how they develop naturally is what's called disturbance. So disturbance is where you have like a wildfire, or you have like a windstorm or an ice storm, and it knocks a bunch of trees down. And then you get young forests coming up in those spaces because enough sunlight hit the ground. And so what the importance of that is that that disturbance historically created diversity of forest. Wildlife benefit and they thrive from forest diversity. And by diversity, I mean different age trees, some really old trees, some really young trees, different kinds of stuff. Like we all know that, right? Like
Mhm.
diversity really helps with just like it's a spice of life, and it's going to help more species than not. But what's happened is there's been kind of a departure from that. And you can interrupt me and ask
No,
questions if I'm talking too much. But
nope, you're good.
so what's happened is there's been an interruption in that disturbance process. The natural disturbances, we don't allow wildfires. We put them out. Smokey told us to. Active forest management. In some ways, it's places we do on in certain places, like on private lands in the Adirondacks, but not on the forest preserve lands. So that's not happening. And so what you end up with is this emerging issue over time where you start losing that diversity in forest habitat, right? On a kind of a small block level. And so that's kind of what's, I think, probably what's happening on the state forest lands is, when people think about it, like, okay, why aren't there any deer there? It's because you've got this kind of homogenous 150-year-old forest, and there's not a lot of diversity in between. But what makes the Adirondacks so interesting on a landscape level is that you do have a lot of private lands here too. And so you have 3 million acres of private lands and a million acres of conservation easement lands up north that are being actively managed, like the Santa Clara Tract and a lot of others. And so on a really big scale, I think, we do have those mosaics, and we do have some diversity. And you see that, like for instance, like with the moose studies, where are you going to find moose? You're going to find the moose on those conservation easement lands where the habitat is good for those particular species. So that's what makes the Adirondacks so interesting and kind of like, but that's also the backstory around it, which I
Yeah, it's
think
fantastic
is
to know.
mhm.
Yeah, I had no idea. I mean, I guess I kind of knew of the logging heritage. I can remember as a young kid, my grandfather taking my brother and I and my cousins to see the museums up there and stuff and
Mhm.
watching videos on PBS of them, these guys just sawing down these gigantic old trees, and you kind of have those images in my head of that. But it's
Mhm.
very interesting to hear you tell that story from, historical perspective of, how we got to the point of having the forest preserve that we do in the Adirondacks. It's interesting.
Yeah, and so and that kind of goes back to the earlier in the conversation when we were talking about what informs us in terms of what conservation is. And so if you've been informed for 130 years that conservation is protection, right? So if you still have that mindset, and to a lot extent it is, right? So there's a lot of ways to define it, and we need to do certain things to keep the parts in place and to keep ecosystems healthy, and protection is a part of all that. But overprotection also has opportunity costs as well. And so sometimes by overprotecting, we're benefiting one part of that ecosystem, but we're putting other parts of that ecosystem in peril. And like for instance, with birds, I was just on a great crowdcast webinar. I wasn't hosting; I was just a guest, just watching it,
Hmm.
about working land mosaics yesterday that my colleagues at RGS did. And there's birds like whippoorwills and golden wing warblers and a lot of others. And this is where the ruffed grouse and the woodcock come in too. They really benefit from that habitat diversity and having some different structure. And forest management helps create that. That's the only path right now that we can have toward creating that kind of diversity and mosaic, that can benefit those species. And the thing with grouse is that they're like an indicator species. They're like a barometer, right? So if they're there, that indicates that that ecosystem is diverse and resilient and healthy. If they're not there, there's something going on with that ecosystem. And so those are the kinds of things we're trying to work with our partners on through RGS and try to solve and be a part of the solution.
Hmm. I mean, what do you see are some of the goals, of that region? Do you see there being a future and is there discussions happening about, more active land management in the forest preserve or Adirondack region? Do you see or hear any of that?
Well, I think so. That's a great question, and I think you're really. I don't see anything changing with the forest preserve within the park or the Catskill Park anytime soon. So the 2.6 million acres that's there in the blue line is probably not going to be managed any differently anytime soon. It's constitutionally protected through Article 14 in New York State's Constitution, so it would require a rewrite of that in a public vote to do that. And you know what is much as and I'm a hunter and I put my hunting hat on. Um, I'm okay with having that as forest preserve in the bigger global kind of scheme of things. You know what? There's just not a lot of places like that, and I can see where somebody that's a member of the 46ers Club that wants to go up and hike, that they find a lot of value and respite and all that stuff. So, I think the opportunity is just like, okay, let's help our private land partners in the park create the mosaic that wildlife need.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because you know what, grouse and woodcock need old forest conditions as much as they need young forest conditions. And so, what they really thrive on, and what other species thrive on, like New England cottontails or golden wing warblers or whippoorwills, is like that is that mosaic of maybe 4 or 5 different kinds of habitat. So the landscape might look like, okay, if I have 1,000 acres, and I'm just using that hypothetically, maybe 10, 12% of that is in really young forest conditions, less than 10 years old. Maybe 10% of that is in really old, forests that are 80 to 100 years or older. And then the lion's share is in the middle, being managed, as a kind of a working, open, multiple use, functioning, healthy ecosystem. And so what that does is that provides a lot of the needs that the wildlife have throughout the different times of the year. It provides food, it provides breeding cover, it provides safety, all of that kind of stuff. So, having old growth, that's in the forest preserve is a good thing if we're looking at it holistically across the entire landscape, and we're supporting our private land partners in conservation equally as enthusiastically as we are the forest preserve, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And there are areas in the areas that we hunt that are, around the old forge side of the park, that there are private land pieces that are actively being worked and thinned out, and the timber's being managed. And you can see there's a cool little piece of property right along Route 28 that I don't know what the name of it is, nor would it benefit me telling everybody what the name of it is. They can figure it out if they're that interested. But it's a smaller piece of property that appears that it was private, and it was somehow either deeded over to some sort of a conservation organization. We hunted that last year. It's open for hiking and hunting, and I think the snowmobile trail might run through there. Amazing. I mean, turkey sign everywhere. There was bear scat. We jumped deer when we were in there. And it was very interesting to see, within that park, within that habitat, here's a piece of property that is open to people to recreate on. And it says right on all the signs, who's managing it, why they're doing what they're doing. It's kind of a test site in a way to see the impact that just, updating taking some trees down, getting some young forest in there. And it was awesome to see. And we did it was the last hunt of our bear hunt. And we were like, hey, we got an hour and a half before dark. Let's just do a quick still hunt through here and see if we find anything. It was like, this is a really cool piece of property that is right here, easy to access, and anybody can use it, for any of the purposes that, whether you're hiking or you're hunting or just going for a walk, it's cool to have that stuff going on there. So I really appreciate the back end on that and understanding, what's realistic, because I think you can get, I have conversations with my friends about like, why not, and I think it's good to understand the big picture as, not just from a emotional side of it, but from a legal side of it, from a scientific side, and some of the things that can be done within the park by the private landowners that are in there that can help make that mosaic, to your point.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so, I think in moving that conversation along around public lands in New York and how we can be a part of the solution to improve habitat diversity, where there are opportunities are on our wildlife management areas, for instance, and, state forests outside of the park, outside of the Adirondacks and the Catskills. So there's something like 190,000 plus acres of wildlife management areas in New York, which are outside of the park. And, I think maybe a lot of people don't even know this, but a lot of those WMAs, they have a history going back into the early 1900s, but that's a lot of hunter and angler funding as well, because a lot of that money to fund those WMAs comes from Pittman Robertson. So, and the Conservation Fund from New York. So, hunters and angler dollars go right into those WMAs. And so they have what's called the Young Forest Initiative. And they've been working since like 2015. Their goal is to create 12,000 acres of habitat diversity and wildlife openings across the system. And I think, for people that might not know this, I mean, there's a lot of, one of the challenges with public land forestry and management is that the process is pretty complicated, because it's a blessing and also it's kind of a slower downer to have the public input and to have these structures in place to actually get stuff done. The planning process is way more complicated on public lands than it is for me to just go out and help you draw up a stewardship plan on your property.
Right.
So like with the WMAs, they've inventoried like 90,000 acres. They've done 56 habitat plans. They've already done about 1,000 acres of work. So I'd like to recognize that and give them credit. There's a lot of more work to be done there, but it's also worth recognizing that it's a challenge with them, because I think with agencies, they often have a big task and they often have their hands tied with funding. And so I think as conservationists, we can kind of move away from the critique stage and also like into the how can we help you get this done stage. And I think that's one way of looking at it.
Now, what like agency within the state is overseeing like that sort of project, that Young Forest Initiative? Who has that ball?
Yeah, so within DC, so the WMAs, they're kind of the points of contact with Young Forest Initiative are through the regional biologists. So those biologists are working for those WMAs, and then there's usually like a forester or forest tech. So for instance, out in I think it's region 7, Adam Perry is out there. And each region, are you in region 9 or region 8 or?
I'm 9, but most of my hunting's done in Region 8.
Yeah, so each region has their contacts from a functional standpoint, but kind of how it works is there's an agency. I think the person that's kind of the point person within DC, as I understand it, is a person named Kate Yard, and she's a biologist in Albany. And then so you have the WMA, you have like a strategic plan for how we're going to manage this in the state. And then you also have basically WMA like unit plans. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So these habitat plans. And that's where, a lot of the legwork has been going on for several years. It's just because you've got to do the inventories, you've got to have the public hearings. They've had like something like, well, I think I read something like 40 public hearings, just leading up to just trying to get this Young Forest Initiative going. And so, and then, a bunch of planning work way before you cut any single tree. So now I think we're moving past the point of all that planning work, all that public hearing work, all the inventory work. And so now I think over the next several years, it's trying to work with them to actually get that stuff done. And you can find that on if you Google like New York State Young Forest Initiative or wildlife management areas, all that stuff's there. And you can look at like which projects are coming down, which ones have been done, where the habitat plans are in, so you can, there's a kind of a really good overview of all that. And it's, that's important to note, because that's a little different than state forests, right? So public lands, we also have these state forests, and they're kind of run on the forest side of things. And you've got within state forests, you've got like different classifications of like multiple use recreation and natural areas and everything like that. So we also have like a New York, like a strategic forest plan for state lands, and then unit plans for each particular region, or how they break it out, like for state forests and so forth. So I guess what, like for a conservationist listening to this, or a hunter and angler, you can go to DEC's site. All I say is just, I encourage you, like it's a lot to keep up with all of that, but one real easy thing you can do is just call your local biologist from the WMA in your region and just say, hey, I'm a hunter and an angler, and if you want to get involved with Young Forest Initiative, say, hey, I'm available if you're looking for volunteers, or, I'm just interested in how this process works.
Mm-hmm.
Is there another public hearing? I think having a working relationship and showing up and having a voice for hunters and anglers, letting them know that we care, that we're relevant, that their work is valued, I think is important.
Yeah, you just hit something that I talked about a couple podcasts ago, is that things in this country get done by people who show up.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something I stole from another podcast that I heard. Guy was going on some rants about, just what's everything that's going on in the country, but it was from a biologist point of view that, if we, as from our values of what we appreciate about the outdoors, if we aren't showing up to any of these public hearings or any of these sort of things, they're not posting on your Facebook and Instagram news feed that there's a public hearing going on next week at the
Mm-hmm.
Region 8 headquarters. That's not being, I'm not seeing that. And I feel like I'm probably way more plugged in than most hunters or anglers. I know I am, because this is what I focused on when I'm not focused on other things. So you bring up a great point there, is that we gotta get involved. And I think it's I don't want to get off the forestry topic yet, but it's something I want to come back around to, as we kind of start to wind out the conversation. But, we talked the other day, we've been talking primarily about public lands, but private lands play a big piece in this too, in forestry management and things of that. And I've had a couple of those live habitat podcasts I've had on here. We're talking with the guys about, mainly managing your property for deer and, better habitat for your hunting. But there's a big piece. So from your perspective and what you're doing in your new role, I can't imagine it's all about public land. You're also trying to work with private landowners, because to the point I made to you the other day, in my frustration with the lack of change in the habitat in many of our public lands in New York State, is that the best hunting always seems to be right on the edges of public land and private, because this guy that owns the private land right next door has got a managed forest or a food plot, or they've got something that's drawing the deer there, and it doesn't gel up. This plan is totally different than that. This 100 acres is totally different than this 100 acres. So you get, that is that mosaic, but the private landowner has a huge impact on the overall environment. So I guess what are you guys doing, and what are you doing in your role now? I would assume that there's some private side of that as well, private land side.
You're absolutely right about all that. Before I get into that, though, I'm going to say that your habitat talks with John Teeter, and that's fantastic. I'm a big fan of John. He's a great land manager and a great resource, and so those are great. Keep those up. I love that. Yeah, he's good. And so, yeah, private lands are incredibly important to conservation. And here's why. So if you look at the Northeast in forest land ownership patterns, we have 50 million acres of forest across the Northeast from New York to Maine. And so that's like 23 Yellowstone parks. I mean, it's huge. It's like vast, like way vaster than anybody can really even imagine. And so within that, 80% of those lands, they're privately owned. So like 40 million acres are privately owned across the Northeast. And so think of that, 4 out of every 5 acres would be in private ownership. And so most of that is in family ownership, where people are just owning property because their family had it, because they're coming to their cabin, because they love the outdoors. The forestry aspect of it helps pay the bills and the taxes, and it helps keep habitat healthy, helps them do what they love. They're not managing it for timber returns per se. It's just contributing to everything, and it's helping them enjoy it. It's helping them keep the property. It's helping them enjoy all the benefits that forests provide. And then, huge opportunity on the like the tracts that are large where they're being managed for commercial forestry as well, because commercial forestry can be extremely compatible with wildlife habitat. So if you have sustainable forestry and you're applying wildlife habitat principles around it and how it's all laid out kind of on the ground, it's all compatible. It can all work. So, if you're going to focus on conservation and you're going to focus on these landscapes, the private sector side has to be in the equation. You have to be figuring out how to work with partners who are already in that space. So there's a lot of what are called consulting foresters across the Northeast. And what they do is they're basically people that run their own business. They're foresters. And if you called them up and you said, hey, Todd, I've got 100 acres and I want you to come to look at it. They can come and they'll work up a forest stewardship plan for you. They can do an assessment of what's on your property, help you with your habitat goals, make recommendations for treatments on the ground that will get you there, that'll keep your forest healthy, to keep the wildlife diversity there. So our role is really dot connecting and supporting those partners. It's like thinking in terms of what's already being done, and then how can we support that? How can we amplify that? How can we get behind that and give it a push? So that's one aspect to our stewardship approach at RGS. And AWS is just like thinking about what do partners need and how can we help them? How can we fill in the gaps? How can we provide funding where there's holes? How can we do things that are going to add value to that? That's what I'm constantly thinking about, and so it's a big task. And, it's apparent that there's a lot of projects out there that can be done. There's definitely a need for it. And, I'll also back up. I didn't talk about this, but one of the driving needs, the indicators here of why we need to do all this in the first place is that I'm going to talk about grouse and woodcock specifically for a minute. Each state has what's called a wildlife action plan. Okay, so the federal government, like maybe back around 2005 or something, prompted the states to do these 10-year wildlife action plans, and in return they get some funding for species. And so one of the things that it does is it identifies what are called species of greatest conservation need. So these are the species in the state that really need attention. They need help because something's going wrong with their habitat. And so there's a lot of them. If you go to New York, you can look at the wildlife action plan, and there's probably a couple hundred species. But I'm going to say that grouse and woodcock are listed as a species of greatest conservation need in 6 of the 7 northeastern states. Woodcock's all 7. Grouse are all 6 other than Maine, because grouse populations are pretty good in Maine, actually. But so what that says then is if they're a bellwether and they're an indicator and they're in trouble, then there's a reason for that. And that reason is generally this habitat diversity issue that we're talking about. So we've got this land use change. We're not doing as much active forest management. We have conversion. What's interesting, I think the hardest thing for people to get around their head is that it's not cutting trees that converts forests away from forests. It's what it is it's usually like development and fragmentation for other purposes. And so if you can encourage forests to stay working, what are called working forests, where you're cutting some of the trees and keeping it financially viable and ecologically healthy, you're keeping landscapes intact. When you stop cutting trees and you make it hard for people to have those carrying costs like property taxes, that's when they start selling to the subdivision development. That's the real problem. It's that, and it's the fact that we're not managing. We don't have enough markets for forest products. So, the part about, and that's a really hard message to get across, that I can save the environment by cutting trees, because by cutting trees, I can keep forest landscapes intact. By keeping forest landscapes intact, I can keep habitat there, and I can keep species on the ground, and I can promote biodiversity, and I can promote carbon sequestration. It's just a weird thing for most people to get in their head, right? But it's
And
it's
that's the challenge of everything that we started this discussion off with is, getting that message out there that's not emotional. It's because everything wants to be emotionally charged. It is a scientific discussion, and everybody defines what they want their science to be nowadays. But I think there's a lot of value to what you just said. It's and it comes back around to that active versus passive, where I think a lot of people forget that our society has grown tremendously. These massive cities that we have, and people living in the areas where they live now is not what it was 100 years ago. It's not 150 years ago. It's so not only is our population grown, we're living in places that are not natural. Natural to the means of what it used to be when a lot of these things were made forever wild or made this or that. So, and it's funny because I listen to a lot of Western podcasts, and I almost pay more attention to the challenges and the issues that they're facing out there, but a lot of them are very similar to the challenges that we're facing here, in that the recreation has changed, where people are living has changed, and there's more of it on both sides of that. There's more recreation, there's more people in the Adirondacks. The amount of houses and the amount of cottages around these lakes. It's like if there's a square foot of lake frontage that can have a cottage crammed in there, there's a cottage in there. So I think as humans, we sometimes forget that we have changed the landscape by our lives, and we can't just think that, well, if that's okay, we'll just leave that over there alone and not help it because oh, there's a bear in my bird feeder. Well, it's like, because you just built a house in the bear's house, like that's, and I think a lot of people just don't think that way. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. One thing I'm thinking a lot about these days is with that. And so, like with my grad school program right now, I'm working through these sustainability frameworks of how can you contribute to sustainability? And there's different ways of thinking about it. And like, for instance, one way is through what's called regreening. So like in some parts of the world, they're like reforesting, and that's helping, like in sub-Saharan Africa, it's helping communities, it's helping health, and it's like clean water and all that stuff. And there's this kind of thought process about rewilding. And there's a professor at Harvard who's incredibly brilliant named E.O. Wilson. And he has this vision of like, okay, what we need to do is just let half the earth just go back to what it is. And I struggle with that so much because I don't even like, and I'm not sure I'm right about this, but I have an opinion. And I'm like, okay, for one, we've been impacting the landscape. We are part of the earth as humans. And so we impact the landscape, and we have for years. And from one aspect, these forested ecosystems aren't the same, like we have invasive species, we've had climate change that's happening. And so we've had human induced kinds of things that are impacting this. Are they resilient enough to just like say, okay, we're just going to leave these things alone now? I don't know, like I'm not even sure that's the right thing to do, but I'm not arrogant enough to say that, that's off the table in every situation. Like maybe in certain places it could work.
Yeah.
And I value the having these ecological reserves, because I think there's great value in having places untouched. Because what happens is, because for many reasons, right? Just because I think in and of itself, and I think the scientific benefits, but to do it on a large scale, I don't know. That's something. I think it has its place, and I think it fits beautifully within a mosaic of other land uses and considerations. But I would really, that's an example where I think, we would struggle. I would struggle with that. And from a practical standpoint, even just with land tenure and ownership and all that stuff. But I think the bigger point there is that that's one tool in the toolkit. And so if we think about different tools, if we don't get monolithic about my way's the only way, but if we promote forest diversity and habitat diversity and mosaics, and be open-minded to the fact that different approaches can work for different ecosystems and communities, that's beneficial. That's going to move us right, I think, in the right direction.
Amen to that. And I appreciate you saying what you just said about that. And because you have to question the ideas, like on paper, some of that stuff sounds fantastic. But if you go into the outdoors and you see the environment, your common sense should tell you we can't go back, unless all these people that built all these things right here want to leave. That's the only way that you can go back. And I think just from all of my time and experience in Colorado, I think Colorado is the perfect example of that. I mean, you go and you've spent some time in Colorado, and my first time out there was 2012, and where it is today, not even 10 years later, in the amount of development and the amount of people that are living in the mountains and traveling to and from the mountains every day, it's insane, and you have these wildfires and these things that happen that just rip and burn through these towns and villages and take away everything that people had. It's like you kind of asked for it. It sounds awful and brutal, but it's like you're going to build a house in the middle of a tinderbox that we haven't let burn. We haven't let nature take its course in some ways. And then we shouldn't be surprised by the outcome. And we shouldn't be surprised that there's mountain lions roaming all over the place when we're not allowed to have an active management plan on how to balance their lives, because we just built a housing development in a place where they've lived for 100 years. It's very hard for me, from my perspective, to look at that and understand how that's not a shared understanding. Like, and I guess, and that's again, like, I love this discussion with you because I respect the snot out of you and I respect your opinions. And I don't know where you stand on something, like that, but I just feel like a lot of it goes all the way back to the beginning of the discussion of the active and passive conservation. It's just like, we as people, we have to understand our impact on the environment and not just think that we can create a plan to put a bunch of solar panels up and we can save everything. It's like there's more to it, and I think we're ignorant to think that those are long-term solutions without looking at the big picture.
Yeah, I mean, you just said so much, and I mean, that's why I'm excited about studying. I mean, that's why I'm studying global sustainability, because I feel like we don't operate in a vacuum. We can't make decisions, without considering the bigger picture. And so I poured my heart and soul into conservation for 25 years, and and I will until the day I die. And I think that, like, having kind of a forward thinking, I think we need to move toward sustainability, and I think there's a nuanced difference there, because I think that, like, that mindset and that outlook in terms of saying, okay, we have these shared goals, we have these shared concerns, we have these wicked problems that we're facing, and just protecting things it's not going to really get what we really need to deal with to fix these wicked problems, right? I mean, we've got serious climate change problems. We've got 700 million people in poverty in the world. We're trying to figure out, how do you have economic growth and prosperity? How do you pull people out of these issues without further impacting the environment, without sending forests down the toilet, so to speak? But there are ways to attack that kind of stuff. There's ways to approach it, but what they need is innovative thinking and forward thinking, and, like, I think kind of a 21st century version of our conservation ethic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we know what got us here,
it.
and there was a lot of good. There's a ton of good things that have been accomplished over the last 100 years. But you're 100% right. There needs to almost be a new image and a new vision of what the next 100 to 200 years is going to look like as we try to get ourselves to that next point.
Yeah, I think so. And I think conservation allows that, because if you look at conservation as a fluid response to how we value and nurture nature, so to speak, it's changed over the years, right? Like, I mean, it's evolved, and it's a process, And, it's gone through the early protections. And then in the 1930s, we went through these incredibly wonderful funding tools so that we have Pittman Robertson. And then it went through the 1960s where we can actually have public input. So it's changed over time. It's responded to evolving conditions. And I think if you think of it in those terms, then that allows that flexibility to grasp onto what we need to do next.
Yeah. I mean, think about the time frames that you just laid out there. I mean, that's 100 years. It took a time to move that boat. And I see, some of these initiatives like the green initiative with the, like GM coming out and saying they're not going to produce in 15 years, under 15 years, they're not going to have a fuel powered vehicle in their offerings, and I see I'm in my industry in the school bus side that, by 2030, there'll be a certain percentage that will be electric. And I look at the barriers, all of that looks so great on paper. And then you go to these communities, you go to these schools, you go to these different places where this sort of stuff needs to be procured. It needs to be infrastructure put in place to be able to handle these things. And that's not a lot of time, 10 years flies by. And it goes back to everything we've been talking. It goes back to everything you said, and looking at the futures, sustainability in a long-term view. All this stuff is great. Like, I'm so for the technology and the innovation, and it's incredible what just in my personal work life, the vehicle that they're working on to have an electric school bus that has the range to go 200 plus miles. It's incredible, like a full-size vehicle like that, and that what they can do with it. But is it ready for me to go out on the street today and sell 100 of them? No, I can't. And our schools can't, and our communities can't handle that. The infrastructure is not there. So like, I think it's something that needs to be, it's all these things are intertangled. These are all just life, culture, everything. We have to understand where we've been, where we want to get to, and how, to your point, the sustainability and everything, it comes back around to that. And I think it goes back to the point of values too. I value a clean environment. I value innovation and moving the needle and getting forward and equality and everything. Like, I value all that, but let's be honest about how we're going to get there, and not, force feed something down everyone's throats about what we're going to do, because that's the quick fix today. Quick fixes don't quite ever work out to be the right decision.
No, that's so true. But that's so true. That the quick fixes, and the irony is that we as humans, like, we like quick fixes, right? Because it simplifies things, and it helps us it helps us compartmentalize and say, this is the reason this is happening, and so we can do this. And if we stop cutting trees, that's good for the environment and makes me feel good. So we like those real quick connections, 2-3 connections. It's easier to understand. It's easy for me to understand. It's easy for me to tell you, stop cutting trees. But those things create other problems. And, moving ahead, we need to be eliminating problems and not creating more problems.
Amen to that. Okay. So as we wrap around on this, I wanted to kind of finish back on the North American conservation model, because that ties directly back to hunters and anglers. And, we're funding that model and what has given us what we have today. But in listening to that podcast, keep going back to your episode you did with the ladies, recreation has become a massive piece of conservation, but there isn't the dollars coming back into support conservation from those interest groups. And it's a discussion I've heard on mainly Western podcasts, because I think it's more of a public lands type of deal out there. And they seem to talk a bit more about conservation than the average Eastern whitetail hunter. But the topic comes up about finding a way to include those outdoor recreationalists in that conservation model when it comes to the funding piece. And I'm interested in your perspective on that, because I hear, some of the hardcore hunters out there, pounding the table saying there's a lot more of them than there are of us. And if we allow them a seat at the table, there's a lot more of them, so they'll have more say. And there's that perception of many of the people that are hikers and campers and people of that nature, they don't understand us as hunters. We haven't painted the greatest picture of what a whitetail deer hunter is or what an elk hunter is over the last 20, 30 years. You know, as hunting television had exploded in the 90s and into the early 2000s, the image isn't always the best. You know, we've heard about the trophy hunting stuff and that. So I kind of curious your standpoint on this, because I think if we're going to move forward, I think that all of those groups need to have a vested interest. You know, you guys on your podcast talked about just this year, you know, the wear and tear on the high peak region and the littering and the trail, you know, the trails that were falling apart because of how much traffic there was on them. And those folks need to understand and you know, a lot of times you don't understand until you are a vested partner in that, you know. And they talked about some of the stuff that they're doing in Vermont with having a fee to get on the mountain bike trails and use those. And that goes back to maintaining them and keeping them up. So I feel like it's super important, but it does scare the hell out of me because I know that there are folks on that side of the fence that don't support hunting. And it does scare me to lose my passion and my heritage. So what's your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, you just said so much, Billy, and I can understand and appreciate that there's a wide range of views and opinions and concerns around this issue, right? Because you can put your hunting hat on and you can say, okay, I don't want things to change. Like, I don't want us to lose our voice by diluting it through having more people come into this. I get that, like, perspective. And I also get, the other perspective. I would say that from my angle, the more funding around the outdoors, we all benefit. It's a rising tide, in my opinion. And so we can either, the fact that there's only 11 million hunters and, we're growing hunting through COVID, right? But the reality is that there's just a lot more people that don't hunt than do. And fortunately, we're blessed with the fact that most people are okay with it, but a lot of people aren't. But we can either be a minority and include people and get more money, or we can be a minority and be monolithic and keep doing what we're doing. And I prefer just having more funding. I think that having people involved at the table, whether they hunt or not, our contributions are incredibly important to fish and wildlife programs, right? And all the financial contributions that we make as hunting and angling communities, we should be very proud of. We should be very vocal about our concerns and be active participants in that process. We're not the only ones, and I don't think we can do all this alone, when it comes to like broader issues. We're going to benefit from having broader funding, from having other people at the table. We add a lot of value as hunters and anglers through the contributions that we've made to habitat, to sound management, to science, to research, to funding. We also benefit from non-hunting conservation measures, like through Land and Water Conservation Fund and stuff like that. So the Environmental Bond Act or anything that's Environmental Protection Fund. So I guess I would say that, we all have a stake in it. The more money that we can bring into this to make good decisions about the broader picture, to keep water clean, to keep space open, keep people outdoors, I think we're going to be better off. I don't really think we have an alternative around, anything else. Like we can either stay in our silo or we can lead. And I think we can lead. I think there's a relevant place for us.
Do you think that's the key to that? There is the fear of losing your ability to go and hunt and your ability to go do that. But do you feel that that's the key, is hunters being the champions of that and being the ones that are talking about the things that you don't want to be braggadocious and saying, look at what we've done, because I don't think that's productive. But being proud of the input and the impact that we've had financially and also with the boots on the ground to help improve habitat and improve, the wildlife that's out there. And I mean, I have a very hard time taking my hunter hat off, because I am so passionate about it. And but I do see, and it comes back to what I said about running on that trail next to the person that doesn't have the same idea as I do. I still love that person. I respect them because we're on that trail, loving that trail together, but it's trying to I think it comes back to, and I'm almost trying to answer your question for you, but it comes back to us as hunters. We have to put out the correct image of who we are.
Mhm.
And I've talked about that till I'm blue in the face on here too. And if we're not portraying ourselves well, you're going to become obsolete, and you're going to lose your relevance in this
Yeah,
world.
I agree with you, Billy, because I think there's a table with a lot of people at that table, right? And so there's already people at that table that aren't hunters and anglers. So we can either have our own table, which is going to be a hell of a lot smaller
Mhm.
and a lot more ineffective, or we can be at the table and we can be leaders with that. And so that's where I think the opportunity is, and it's where the need is. And I know that's not even comfortable, because I know that puts us out there in a vulnerable situation, because you and I are concerned about the future of hunting as much as anybody. And we know that there's people out there that work to diminish that, But I think that the way that we keep things moving forward is by keeping it relevant, by keeping our position relevant, by leading, by communicating well, and by being good partners in a way bigger picture around conservation. And that's, and I think that we can do it. I think there's people out there that get it, and I think that there's certainly a need for it. And so I think, it's not easy, but it's there for us if we choose to do it.
Yep. I love it, Todd. And that's why I wanted you to be the guy on here to have that discussion about all these things. This is stuff that's been burning me up for a while and wanting to communicate it on this platform, but I never quite know how to. I'm not good. You're good, and I'm feeling you bringing a different side out of me to discuss this stuff. And it's just I think it's good discussion needs to be had, and it's things that need to be looked into and understood, and reflectionary type of stuff that people need to I'm just going to keep saying it. People just have to be aware of what they're putting out there. I mean, everything we do every single day, you have the first thing you want to do is pick up your phone and post about it, and you don't know who's watching, and you just have to be cognizant of that. And I'm excited to get on the website and see, who those regional people are in my area with the state, and find out when some of those public hearings are. Because whether it's me that can go or it's somebody that listens to this podcast, it's just getting the word out there for people to get involved. And it doesn't have to be 1,000 people, it's just a couple people to show up and just maybe give a different point of view. And that's what this is all about. It goes all the way back around to the start of the podcast. It's trying to bring a discussion to people that they may not be hearing elsewhere. And we have a unique thing. There's only a couple, 2, 3 of us that are doing this in New York with a hunting based focus on a podcast. And there's a lot going on right here on our soil that, in a way, when it comes to the spoken word, it's up to us to, tell people what's going on and help get them understanding what sort of things we can and should be doing in our communities to make sure that the future's bright. So.
Absolutely. And I'd say keep up the great work. I think you're doing a great job at it. I love what you're doing with the platform, the conversations that you're living it. Your lip voice, and it's so important. And I'm just always thrilled to be here on your podcast. And this was such a great conversation, Billy. And I look forward to the next one. Anytime we ever catch up, we never know where the conversation's going to go.
We don't.
Every time there's something that's like a little bit like a unique where, hey, I didn't see this coming. And I'm awful glad that we went down that path.
Yep. No doubt, Todd. So good. Best of luck to you with your new job here on your second month in, and we'll stay in touch. We will, and keep my eye out for you, and we'll catch up again soon.
You got it. Thanks, Billy.
Yeah.
Have
thank
a great
you
day.
for everything. You too.